entitled The Role of Sustainable Energy in Economic Recovery Packages. And this webinar is supported by the Al-Attiyah Foundation in partnership with Refinitiv. The Al-Attiyah Foundation is an independent think tank aimed to provide robust and practical knowledge and insights on global energy and sustainable development topics, and so to communicate these benefits for the benefit of the Foundation's members and the wider community. But before we start the session, again, thank you all for joining. I'd like to just run over some housekeeping issues and rules. You can see on your screen, for any technical issues you experience during the webinar, you can click on the chat button at the side of your screen. You can type your concern and my colleague will assist you. Please click on the 3 horizontal buttons next to the red X mark to activate the Q&A and the poll session on your screen. So we will have a couple of polls throughout the course of the session, and we will have plenty of time for Q&A towards the end of the session for around 20 minutes. For any questions for the speaker, you can click on the Q&A and direct the question to me, the presenter. Please note that in the interest of time, we will be unable to address all of the questions with all of the speakers, but I will endeavour my best to try to represent everyone. And during the session, you will be participating in polling questions, as I mentioned, and they'll appear on your screen. We're going to allow you roughly 30 seconds to respond to those polling questions, and there will be 2 of them throughout the next hour. And the recording of this session will be circulated to all attendees after the webinar has ended. So let me give you a short introduction to the session and to the topic. So I believe that there is a slide to be shown, but from my perspective, this is a very important topic. It has even become more important in the context of COVID-19 and the impact that that has in terms of stimulus and recovery. So you can see very clearly that there are clean energy shoots and growth trends over the last number of years, especially around technologies focused on renewable energy, electricity. But this year especially has seen a significant shock in the global markets, resulting in a 20% decline. Now, what we are seeing is that decline significantly affecting fossil industry, as you can see from the graph from the International Energy Agency on the right-hand side. Oil and gas, compared to the investment this year, our projected investment this year compared to last year is very, very significant. Now, what countries are trying to do, the terminology of build back better, but they are trying to establish recovery plans coming out of COVID-19 that can focus on more sustainable energy in terms of their recovery. And that's what the session today is about. And so that aligns those countries' objectives with not only their national and international targets and commitments, and enable them to contribute significantly to achieving the goals of Paris and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So what are policymakers now considering? They're considering things like sustainable recovery, how to avoid business as usual and go back onto a trajectory that involves significant decarbonization of their systems, and of course making the best use of technology advances. And that's really what the focus of today is about those aspects and those challenges really associated with sustainable recovery. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the speakers for the session. So Josh Delbecque is a professor at the European University Institute in Florence and at the KU Leuven in Belgium. He's been the Director General of the European Commission's DG Climate Action since its creation in 2010 until 2018, and we are very honoured to have Josh as part of the panel. Thomas Rieger is a leading solar kiosk solution and innovation departments. So his main focus is on commercializing solar kiosks, innovative solar power integrated infrastructure solutions, and on researching and developing new ways to use solar kiosk technology in order to address the various needs to achieve adequate solutions in frontier market situations. So we're very honored to have two leading speakers and presenters here with us today. Before we go into the presentation component and the Q&A component of the session, we would like to ask all of the attendees our first poll question. So let me frame the question. What kind of stimulus packages and incentives would help the most in shaping a sustainable future? So A is new economic zones for free trade and export, and that is really about attracting more foreign investment and generating more revenue and jobs. B are support schemes for medium, small, medium SMEs. And those type of support schemes might include such as guarantees offtake for priority projects. And C, the inclusion of clean energy policies in COVID-19 recovery packages. And what type of policies? Really, we refer here to provisions to incentivize green homes, energy efficiency, carbon capture, etc. So that's the poll. If all of the delegates participating in the webinar wish to submit an answer, that would be great. And we'll just give it a few seconds to register. And as you can see on the right-hand side under the polling is where you can submit your response. So we can see from now that there's a clear winner, which is the inclusion of clean energy policies in COVID-19 recovery packages, which is great to see because that's a lot of what the focus is of today, but we will touch on a couple of the other stimulus package areas as well as the next hour continues. So let me move into the main area of the seminar this morning and this afternoon, depending on your location. Let me introduce the two speakers or give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. So, Josh, maybe you can provide a 2-minute introduction to yourself, your background, and where your main focus is. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, and good morning or good afternoon to all of you. Well, I have been the Director General for Climate Action at the European Commission for 8 years. And since then, I joined the European University Institute in Florence, in Italy, and I'm teaching as well in Leuven University on climate and sustainability issues. Now, it's very important to see how the inclusion of clean energy policies in the COVID-19 recovery packages is happening as we speak in the European Union. In 2019, the new European Commission decided on the Green Deal. In that same year, the heads of state of the European Union decided on climate neutrality as a goal for the EU by 2050. So that was before the COVID crisis. But then this all had to be translated into a budget. And in the middle of the budget discussions came the COVID crisis. Now, the outcome was that was made in July of this year. And that historical deal is about the staggering amount of money that have been decided upon, 1,800 billion euros. So that is a combination of grants and loans, but still it's a staggering amount, 1,800 billion. And what is important is that there were 3 guiding principles on this. That is that all this money needs to be spent in a way that is climate related or is not doing harm to the overall objective of the climate neutrality by 2050. 30% of that amount of money needs to be linked directly to climate objectives. And it also foresees the creation of a just transition fund that's mainly for coal mining regions where there are major changes coming and the workers need to be retrained, so social programs are foreseen in that. Now, this amount of money that is almost twice as big as what was originally planned for, is going to be used for climate-related purposes. And what is very important is that this year still, there is going to be a raging debate about how to review the overall target of the EU for 2030. That is currently set at 40%, and that may be reviewed up to 55% reduction based on 1990 emissions. Now, at the heart of this is the emissions trading system, and that ETS system is up for review next year. And what we expect is that the prices for carbon on the ETS regime is going to raise stark. The free allocation is going to go down. And so there is going to be quite a heated debate about how to review the ETS, because one of the most essential elements is the border adjustment mechanisms that are announced and in principle have been decided upon by our heads of state. So in a nutshell, what matters a lot to the European experience is the combination of targets, of finance, incentives to industry, but all this has been reinforced due to the COVID crisis. So we are hopeful that this will be a splendid opportunity to redirect a number of funds that currently were planned for investments in solutions that are going to be higher today compared to what was planned for. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Josh. And it's very clear that the European Commission, especially, and the European Union is engaged in significant policy making at the moment. And there is a very clear link between sustainable energy and sustainable finance. And that's something that we'll touch on in the later session. Let me introduce Thomas. Thomas, if you want to maybe introduce your company and what your vision is for sustainable recovery as well. Thomas, thank you.
Matt, thank you very much. There were just some staggering numbers and goals put into it. We are a private sector company with a little bit less ambitious goals, let me say. We've been founded in 2011 against the backdrop of over 1 billion people in this world not having access to electricity. And following the Sustainable Development Goal number 7, our goal was to bring renewable, affordable energy to those people. So we founded Solar Kiosk. We invented a solar-powered infrastructure solution, and we ventured out to sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asian countries to realize projects there and to bring to even give access to electricity for last mile rural communities. So you can say we're very specialized in the off-grid sector whatsoever. We're also involved in larger on-grid utility scale projects, all on photovoltaic solar technologies. Since then, we've come a long way. We have used our solutions for various purposes in commerce, in education, in the health sector. Currently, we're doing projects together with the United Nations to give African and Southeast Asian countries the ability to establish corona testing laboratories in off-grid environments. And we're moving on along those lines. We see that, you know, when in the beginning of this year, we had the ever-growing pipeline of opportunities to realize projects that all faltered in the face of the corona crisis whatsoever. When we're talking about recovery, stimulus packages, I hope that I can give a little bit of voice to the importance to continue the development track of lesser developed nations that do have an issue with a lot of off-grid communities that are off-grid, that are not connected to the grid, and hopefully we can also bring a little bit of this aspect into the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. The perspective you're coming from is very interesting. Many SMEs are looking at the concept of decentralized grids for more resilience in terms of supply of electricity and energy. So this is a very hot topic, not only in terms of energy markets and trading, but in terms of security of supply, and actually where the real innovation is happening. So we hopefully in the next few minutes we get to touch on some of that work. In terms of everyone who's listening and watching us online, in terms of the format, I'm hoping to direct a couple of questions now to the speakers. Then I'll have some specific questions for Josh and for Thomas, and then of course there's an opportunity afterwards for Q&A. The questions are coming in, so please feel free to add to them. We'll have ample amount of time for Q&A before we close in roughly 45 minutes. So this is aimed at both of you, Josh and Thomas. The government policies and the actions, I mentioned at the start, we can no longer do this type of business as usual that a lot of countries' policies are engaging in. And now countries can see that only a transformative change can help them in becoming more resilient. So, of course, the narrative is talking about resilience a lot. In your view, what type of change is best required to deliver on this type of transformation, and what areas do you think that economies should focus on and policymakers should focus on? So maybe Josh, over to you first, and then followed by Thomas.
Well, thank you, Matt, and thanks, Thomas, as well for this very stimulating introduction. I think that the most important change that we are currently experiencing in the EU and worldwide is the fantastic cost reduction for new renewable technology, combined with new technological developments, such as battery development, storage, and in the case of Europe, also the upcoming digitalization of the energy system. So that makes a revolution. And that creates also new questions to the policymakers. And one of the most important questions is now that the share of renewables is drastically increasing in our economy, is how to cope with the flexibility of power generation due to the solar and the wind part of the renewable energy generation. Because if the wind is blowing and the sun is not shining, then there is no electricity. So that flexibility needs to be catered for. And we are only at the beginning of the story, because you can work on demand and you can work on supply. You can work on demand, for example, you can ask companies that are particularly energy intensive in their production processes to use more electricity when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, in particular during weekends, for example. And the market is already reacting to that with market prices that are very low, sometimes negative during those periods. But still, we are at the beginning of dealing with this variable nature of carbon-free electricity that is in masses now being introduced in the European system. And I think that finding that notch between the new technologies coming and new policies required to deal with this degree of flexibility, I think is a challenge to all of us. We are going through that in Europe, but I think that the rest of the world is going to see and is already experiencing similar trends because renewable energy is even more important when there is more sun and more wind than what we have in Europe. And that's certainly the case for Africa and major parts of Asia. So that is where I would summarize where we are in Europe. This increasing flexibility is being catered for, but is not yet completely embedded yet in the regulations that we are currently having, in particular in the power sector.
Thank you very much, Josh. We're going straight into the crux of the matter. We're trying to balance the intermittency of renewable energy and the challenge of flexibility with new technologies that might solve that solution in terms of storage and batteries. I'm sure, Thomas, you have some views on this in terms of where you think the focus should be made, because the focus to date, not only within Europe, but in large economies, has been on centralized systems. And the challenge of that is around intermittency. What's your view in terms of where the focus should be placed?
I can just close in on what has been said before, and it's not only valid for Europe; it's valid especially where we're working at mentioning the cost reductions. Absolutely. When I started to work in the solar field in 2004 in China, where I lived 10 years to work in this industry, I have seen drastic price reductions for PV modules. The same is projected for battery technology, and battery technology for me, as working in the off-grid sector, of course, is a key on where we need to go to. But I also want to mention, transmission, which is a very important point, and transmission architecture is maybe something we will discuss a little bit later. Like you just mentioned, right now we have a top-down transmission architecture, and we need to realize that it's going to be a decentralized, generation and transmission infrastructure that we need to be looking at if we want to bring more decentralized renewable energy into the system, into the grid. And also looking at what do we do with those areas where there is no grid and where there will never be a grid because, the cost of the last mile connection is just too high. Looking at, decentralized off-grid systems that can bring a solution here is definitely important. But let me also just say that, when I lived, since I've been working in this space, I have seen, such tremendous changes in the whole sector and in how governments and countries look at, this business as usual, the transformations that have been happening in the space from the first introduction of feed-in tariffs in Germany, over to introduction of tariffs of solar panel, which certainly gave a big blow to all German solar companies that are slowly recovering as the government gets back and creates a more favorable environment for renewable energy companies. That certainly, is a very complex field, and we need to look, at so much, it's such a complex field of different rules, regulations, etc., across the world, especially in developing nations, that this is certainly definitely something that we need to be looking closer at. How can policies, influence, how we are going to come out of this crisis? Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. And let me stay with you for a moment, because you talk about the importance that governments play, the importance that they will play in terms of stimulating some investment, but also in terms of the policies that they write. Now, it's different globally in terms of investment this year than it was last year. The money may not simply be there for government. And a lot of what we've talked about now today has been about new technologies, new investments, new incentives. This idea of a recovery, how does that happen if governments no longer have the level of investment that they foresaw before COVID? So how can you best promote stimulus and recovery at a time of challenge in terms of investment? So Thomas, maybe you can talk about really what do you think the role of that type of stimulus package would be, or the role of different types of incentives, certainly in this economy as we go through a recovery?
Thanks a lot. I think, when you talk about investment that needs to come into the space in order to bring recovery in the right sectors and recovery in what we're hoping that the recovery is going to look like, it's not only a government activity. we're currently living in a unique environment where you don't get interest rates on money that you have on hand, and there is enough private sector money that is looking for being invested in projects, and the, let me say, sustainability that these investments are looking for are certainly topics that such projects definitely will bring along. Now, looking at this and realizing the potential that can come from private sector investments, not only government sector investments, how can we create a policy environment that will favor such investments and give the private sector a role, to invest in such projects and to play a crucial part in the recovery and in building, what I call a new green, a reinforced green economy where businesses are going to thrive, where jobs are going to be created, where we can transition out from what has been mentioned before, from a coal focus and oil focus industry towards a renewable industry. I think that's an interesting question that we also can look at. So, yeah,
thank you. Thank you.
That gives a light there.
No, it certainly does, and I'm going to ask Josh for his input now. But it's great that the focus should be on the private sector to stimulate investment. That's 100% true. But there are barriers but there are multilateral banks that are there to provide such aid and such investment and guide what areas that investment should be targeting. Josh, from your background as well, there are barriers. Maybe you want to tackle what role for economic stimulus, but also what you perceive as the barriers, especially for policymakers in the current environment of recovery.
Yes, thank you for the question. And picking up where Thomas left it, I think renewable energy is a lot of capital expenditure that needs to be financed. I mean, the operational expenditure is much less. It's maintenance, basically. So the capital expenditure brings us to the capital market. And the interest rates on capital markets are very low. So what can public authorities do? That is removing the barriers that are non-financial in nature. And that is the regulations that are currently in place that are not always very friendly to renewable energy or to coping with the flexibility that may have to be coped with. And that brings us to the more fundamental question about policies, because in the end, we need good policies. And Thomas was indicating the importance of feed-in tariffs that we had in Europe in the early days of renewable energy. Now we are leaving all of it aside. And what is the most fundamental policy experiment that Europe was going through was putting a price on carbon. And we are working a lot with other people in the world to sharing that experience. We did it through a carbon market, through the European trading system. Others may do it through carbon taxes or in other forms, but it's very important that there is an explicit price on carbon, because the investments in solar, in wind energy have no carbon related to it. And that makes the competition more healthy between investments in coal and investments in the renewables. And I would say today, when I look at the fundamental elements that the market is showing, that is that investments in coal are very risky and will create possibly a lot of stranded assets because they may be built for a lifetime of 30, 40, 50 years. But with current things developing, and in particular in the field of renewables, and if we put on top of that a price on carbon, the lifetime of a new coal-fired plant will be much less compared to what many investors still today is going to be the case. So in a summary, I would say let's concentrate on market barriers or barriers to the right decisions that we need in the future, and putting a price on carbon is very essential. We try to do that in the context of the United Nations. with an international carbon market that was not a success. Let's put it like it is. The CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, was not a success. The prices are ridiculously low today compared to the market prices we are having under the ETS in Europe, which are close to 30 euros per ton of carbon, and is increasing. It's going upward, and we think that's a healthy development. And by the way, a carbon market or a carbon tax also produces a lot of revenue that can be used to give guarantees to industry when guarantees are needed to overcome the barrier to investing in renewable energy. So the revenue side is also important, but the most important is for sure the price, the explicit price on carbon, to encourage carbon-free investment and to discourage carbon-intensive investment, such as investment in new coal facilities.
Thank you very much, Josh. And that point is well made in terms of carbon-based mechanisms, carbon pricing mechanisms. It seems to be the mantra within Europe and across Europe, but also in other jurisdictions where they've brought in their own specific carbon pricing schemes. I might touch on later the challenge of having that integrated internationally under the UN in terms of accounting mechanisms, but for now, it seems that what you're talking about is having investment that is conditional on reducing carbon. Is that fair to say? And if it is conditional on that, how can you link that type of investment with sustainability criteria?
Well, there are several ways of doing that, but I would not underestimate the importance of national authorities. I think that perhaps in Europe and in the context of the climate negotiations, we were too much looking at international finance. And I'm not saying that international finance and support for green investment is not important, but when we look at things, national regulations matter the most. And I think that is what we are doing currently at the European University Institute in Florence, is that we give training to executives on how to establish carbon markets, not an international carbon market, but putting a price on carbon in a national context as part of a national energy policy. And when you do that, then that opens up the avenue for a much broader debate on development goals, because a carbon market can be established because we know how to do the measurements, the verification, the reporting, all this infrastructure that you need. We have plenty of good experience on that. And once that is in place, you can have a solid carbon market and a solid revenue generating mechanism that can be used to focus further on the specific barriers that need to be focused on. For some, that could be water. For others, that could be a good grid system or an efficient grid system or new investments in grid systems. So the solutions may be, again, at the national level, be very different. But that is what we have to do. We have to recognize the differences between national realities, have national policies to cope with that. And once we have done that, then we can think about how to link up all these experiences with good international systems available. But let's start at the national level. Let's not start at the international level. I think that's a very important element that I would like to pass over. And as Thomas indicated, financial markets are very international in nature, and the rates that are currently being charged on those international finance markets are historically low. So that's an additional opportunity for investing in renewable energy solutions.
Thank you, Josh. Before I move over to Thomas, just to pick up one point, really, which is it easy to take carbon out of the system in an industry that isn't hugely carbon intensive? What about the industries that have significant carbon intensity? How can they make commitments to carbon reductions? Are they the ones that are will those industries no longer exist in this kind of net carbon free world? And how fair is that?
That's a very good question. And I would say whether they are going to continue to exist lies in their own hands. Because there are technologies around how to take out the carbon out of the products or the production processes that they are currently using. We have carbon capture and storage as a technology. We have carbon capture and use. And I think it's unavoidable that the world goes into that direction. Now that brings us close to another energy carrier we have not been talking about, and that is hydrogen. Because hydrogen could be a very important energy carrier, more than gas or oil or other energy carriers we have today. And if properly made, it can be carbon free. And that brings us to the carbon capture and storage technology. That is not cheap, let's face it. It needs investments into that. But I think what the Europeans are doing with the border adjustment mechanism is just saying that to the rest of the world. If you want to continue exporting to Europe, it will have to be with imports that are much less intensive in terms of carbon. The way to do that is technology. And I think that major companies in the energy sector know that technology and could invest into that. Now, again, the rates on international capital markets are such that they are very low. So that, I would say, is a historical opportunity, apart from investments in renewables, to go into the greening of carbon-intensive facilities, either in the energy sector or in industrial facilities. This is a new technology, but I see the whole world is investing into it. I have been doing training outside Europe, on the fringes of Europe, but also in countries like India or China or Korea or South Africa, or several countries in Latin America like Chile. They are all looking into that, but they are sitting a little bit on the fence, because it's a huge capital investment. But that is a signal that Europe, and I would like to repeat that, wants to give through the border adjustment mechanism, as much as the European Investment Bank, that on its own has decided as of 2021 no longer to engage in investments related to fossil fuels. So as one of the biggest investment banks in the world, that matters. And I see that a lot of investment funds are following also that logic that the European Investment Bank made very, very clear. So to cut it short, companies in the energy sector have an opportunity to decarbonize their output before they export it to other places in the world, and in particular to Europe. It's going to be a lot. Thank you.
Excellent, Josh. Passing over to you, Thomas. So, Thomas, you are one of these companies that are the light, the shining light to get us all to net zero. So, promotion of solar technology. In your view, are the investments in clean technologies happening fast enough? Is the first question. But the second question being, are the grids resilient enough that if your technology is ready, that you can deploy it? So maybe you could answer both of those questions, Thomas.
Thanks a lot, Matt. I actually want to do a quick loop over to what Joe has been saying, and just adding to what he said. I think one important point in the whole discussion, Joe, and thanks a lot for mentioning that there's this huge capital investment to carbon capture, carbon storage, looking at, big carbon emitters, carbon intensive industries, to introduce this carbon CO2 mechanism. I mean, it's not only, because it's a fun exercise to do, but when you look at the costs that are related with carbon emissions in terms of, increasing costs of healthcare, increasing, costs through climate change, etc., I only say it is fair enough to close the loop and to say we need to factor in those costs into our economies, which again, goes back to what you say and what you promote. So I just want to say, for me, it's natural. It should be done worldwide. In the end, I'd rather invest now into these technologies that decarbonize the economy and later don't have, the costs that will follow inevitably. We have been talking about how hot it is in Brussels and in Berlin, and where does that come from, right? We can all ask ourselves the question. So that just to close into what you said. Now over to your question, Matt, and thanks a lot for that. Look, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the off-grid space first, because that's where we live in and that's where we breathe in. You can say that in the past years, accumulated $1.7 billion have been invested in this space. That investment has managed to pull over 400 million people out of energy poverty, right? So that's a significant investment, you could say. If I listen to some of the figures that Joe gave us, it's a drop on a hot stone, right? I know there is more money that needs to come in this space and that wants to come in this space. If you look at, organizations like Wood Mackenzie, et cetera, they estimate that 71% of the whole world will be connected to electricity through mini-grid solution, through off-grid solution, et cetera, right? So it's going to come. It's going to come. It can come slow. It can come by, companies like us continuing the fight and convincing people to take on this source of energy, or it can come, with a little bit of help, which we already discussed a little bit before, right? I mean, if governments and utilities also don't rethink the strategies, it's going to be the private sector that will push. And today you can say that some of the, first big projects have reached grid parity at this stage using PV without, huge subsidies or whatever. Compare that to, centralized carbon-based, fossil energy generation. So let's look at that and let's realize that and put it into context. For me, I know that, we mentioned the multilateral banks, the DFIs out there. They want to come in this space. They want to create stimulus, but they also want to invest because they want to decarbonize. And BlackRock was one of the first that followed that said we have to decarbonize our investments, and others will follow. So even, the general public is asking for this. Consumers are asking for this. Consumers asking for products that have been, produced carbon neutral. And that will attract investment. Investment is there. Investment wants to go in this space. And closing into what Joe rightfully said, let's get rid of the barriers and the investment can come into it. And an investment at currently, historical low levels of interest rates will only be happy to see this sector thrive, generate returns, and it's a meaningful and also sustainable investment into this. When you ask me about our grids resilient enough to do all of this, I mentioned before, the grid certainly needs to be rethought as it is today, because traditionally over the past 100 years, we have been, forming a grid that's a top-down grid architecture, right? Now with decentralized energies, you need to rethink the strategy and you need to look at new technologies. We talked about digitalization. We talked about, having sort of an intelligent grid that can manage the users, where small example, you have a washing machine at home, you put your clothes inside, the washing machine communicates with the grid and only starts running when there is enough sunlight, so to have the energy from renewables to do all of that. You can shift a lot of the power demand through things like that. And yes, definitely there is a need to think about current grid architectures, and again, transmission and storage is a huge, thing into that. Germany in the summer is creating so much renewable energies, and we only have 20% of our energy needs created by renewables, that at some stage we have too much energy. Energy is exported to, let's say, one of the examples is to Norway, where we use that energy to refill hydro dams and to have, the ability to generate hydroelectricity whenever it is needed, and we don't have sun. So, all these technologies that are there already, and certainly there needs to be more investment into this, can help, to shift and to make it work.
Yes, yes, Thomas.
Yes.
I think you're completely right in that. Firstly, you talked about where investment is coming from, and it's coming from corporates that are looking at more environmentally sound criteria in terms of their investment. And also where the demand is coming from the citizens who are looking for that type of investment. And they want better services, but they also want greening of their technologies and are very conscious of their climate impact. But let me just alter this a little away from variable renewables, because if one of the main challenges is, well, we need more electrification, we need more resilience of our communities and our societies, is storage a thing that is so expensive at the moment, that is so far away, when people only want access to electricity? So can I say, do you see, in terms of your decentralized model, a role for storage and flexibility, or is it we're going to provide energy through solar and it's use it or lose it at that point?
No, just like I mentioned, especially for us, storage is key. You're working in off-grid, and you don't have the grid as a backup. You don't have other alternative energies coming in, so storage for us is key, right? And I just mentioned, also on a national level, on a bigger level, storage will be key into this, right? And there is so many technologies out there now where you use underground caves with steam turbines, to store energy that has been created by renewables, down to, lead gel, lithium batteries. Now, everybody's looking at the cost of those and also the environmental impact and, recycling technologies that are, for example, not there for lithium batteries, while the car industry, EV industry is jumping on lithium technologies. Then we are looking at redox flow, vanadium technologies that are coming on. There will be, and this sector is driving it, and the EV sector is driving it, and the renewable energy sector is driving it. There is huge investment into R&D on new battery technologies that are key. Battery and transmissions are key, but sometimes you don't have transmissions. And when we look at off-grid, battery is still key, right? It just has to be there, because in the nighttime there is no sun. Now you combine wind and sun, you have a little bit of alleviation of the issue, but again, you're not guaranteed to have 100% uptime. So battery needs to be there, in my opinion.
That's great, Thomas. Certainly my work, I would have focused a lot on storage technologies, and the main, of course, the investment is there, but maybe the capacity, the intellectual capacity, the R&D capacity, because you are dealing with storage of so many different technologies, and you are talking about chemists, talking to electrical engineers, linking with data analytics people to understand the data flow. So, there is a big opportunity here for more capacity to be built in the system that can actually inform the growth of these and how all these technologies talk to each other. Let me come over to the poll. We have one final poll question, and then I'm going to move to the Q&A from the audience, because we've received a lot of questions. So the quick poll, the last of our two polls: which sector should rescue funds be most channeled into to ensure a green economy recovery? So whether it is public transport as A, whether it's agriculture as B, and whether it's renewable energy production as C. So which sector? And I guess this answer might reflect what country you're from, but also what technology you're both familiar with. So yes, feel free to select your answer in terms of the poll on the right-hand side, and then I'm going to move to the greater audience's questions. So a lot of the focus this morning has been on renewable energy production. So as we wait for the results to come in. Let me move to the audience Q&A. Josh, I'm conscious that I haven't really asked you to speak a lot about the European Green Deal, but in this context, we have okay, the poll results are in. Renewable energy production is the winner by 46%, with transport at 27% and agriculture at around 8%. So renewable energy production, as I mentioned, has a role within both transport and ag, but it's good to see it playing a dominant role, and certainly in our audience and where they would invest their finance. So, Josh, I'd mentioned the Green Deal. One of the questions that's coming in from Tim Patterson is around the Just Transition Fund and what type of companies and technologies that fund is helping. Does it allow for green energy minerals and mining production, as in copper from EV buses in places like Poland and beyond, to electrify underground equipment? So really, that's a very specific question, but what is the essential focus of the Just Transition Fund?
Okay, well, the Just Transition Fund has been created as an add-on to the Innovation Fund. And I think those two need to be seen together. If it is about new technologies, then part of the revenues from the ETS, from the carbon market, goes to the Innovation Fund. That's quite a significant fund. With current market prices today, it's more than 10 billion that is set aside there. The Just Transition Fund has a more social element into it. That is that, for example, in coal regions that need to be restructured and reinvented almost totally, will need a lot of funds for attracting alternative investment. Now, it is for the company in question to see whether it fits best, either under the Innovation Fund, whether new innovations can be commercialized, or whether it is part of an overall regional policy that needs to be invented. Now, you asked me about the Green Deal in general. I think that part of the Green Deal is a lot about industrial renovation, because in Europe, we have a manufacturing industry that is still very important, despite the fact that main parts of it have been globalized to other places in the world. We still have a manufacturing industry, and it is an explicit objective of the Green Deal to reinvent manufacturing industry on a low carbon basis. And in that sense, whether we talk batteries or hydrogen or new minerals, they can come in as the target sectors for Green Deal loans or grants. I think that is an important addition to be made, because when we look at new technologies and batteries and storage and all the rest of it, in fact, we have to distinguish between two types of technology. The technologies to the energy use of the citizen, where we all are as a citizen small energy users, compared to big energy users like steel manufacturing or chemical plants or cement kilns, where masses of energy are being consumed in a short period of time. And there the technology solutions may be very different. And hence the new attention that the hydrogen economy is getting, mainly for this heavy energy and carbon intensive industries that need to reinvent themselves if in Europe we want to go to climate neutrality by 2050. So to cut a long story short, there are lots of funds available. More of a social nature, I would say, is the Just Transition Fund. But I would not exclude new investments. It's all, the details still have to be figured out, basically. But also look at the Innovation Fund, because if it is about to commercialize new innovations into the market, then that Innovation Fund may be much more attractive compared to the Just Transition Fund.
Excellent, Josh. A question for you, Thomas, which is really about the competitiveness of the intermittency of renewables. So, and what costs are included and what costs aren't. Often the intermittent renewables, say for example solar, your business, doesn't include backups, transmission line reinforcements, reduced utilization of power assets and infrastructure. So this, if you include the full total system costs, does it make renewables less competitive or competitive at all versus fossil? So over to you, Thomas.
Well, what a great question. We haven't been talking about this, but this will come later in the Q&A as well. Currently, $3 trillion are poured into subsidies concerning fossil fuels, and that includes, air pollution, climate costs, and direct subsidies. And direct subsidies for fossil fuels, if I build a coal-fired plant somewhere, needs new transmission lines, needs this, needs that, right? It's been factored in. If you look at renewable energy projects, utility scale projects, we're involved in a couple of those. Of course, everything up to the connection of the transmission line needs to be factored in. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to attract investment and you wouldn't be able to negotiate PPA prices, etc. Right? What comes after there? That's transmission line issues and looking at a national energy plan that factors in new sources that come from renewables versus existing sources of power assets and how to handle that and how to structure, let me say, the combination of those is certainly something that needs to also be played on a national level. What we can do is what we can do. We can bring, renewable energy that today, again, projects are coming down to grid parity, looking at some first examples in India and others where the prices, are competitive to coal and other things. And then let's look, at shifting some of those, subsidies and balance them out. And I think we can, factor in those costs and say, yes, if you take all of that in, definitely we can be competitive.
Yeah, understood. We're coming close to the end. I have another couple of questions, but because you mentioned coal and oil, and Thomas, you're completely right. And certainly, in my view, when I talk about renewables, I say, well, interconnectors work for everyone. It's not just wind or solar energy that they move across; they move everything. So, and grid reinforcement is a need across society. There is a question in terms of oil and the role that oil companies will play in terms of the push for sustainability, Thomas. And this will be the last question for yourself. But some oil companies, this person putting the question cites BP, but they plan to invest in renewables. What, in your view, is this big push from oil companies for sustainability, and will that not be more complex going forward in terms of to push for sustainability and what role the fossil industry will play, our traditional fossil industry? Let me frame it that way.
Well, let me say BP is not pushing into this. BP has already invested in renewables. So did Total, so did Shell. So let me just say the oil companies recognized, that there will be a phase out of fossil fuel energy and things will shift towards renewable energies, and therefore their investment is going into this space. We've been working with Total. We know the Shell Foundation is doing a lot of work in these sectors, and it's just clear that you recognizing that you were recognized as an oil company, but basically you are an energy company, and renewable energies, are serious and have been recognized by those companies. If you want to stay in that, you need to invest now, and you need to invest across the bank. And you look at some of the big oil companies that have been not only investing, let me say, in big energy generation, but even down to distribution of solar-powered lamps in off-grid locations such as Total, what they're doing with the Avango brand, into mini grids, into off-grid. It needs to be recognized that, there will be a shift for those oil companies that are more forward-looking, and the other one, they will have, you know, a dying out business model if they don't recognize that this needs to be done. So, you know, I applaud it, and I applaud the increasing significance for those companies on the renewable sector, basically.
Okay, Thomas, yes, and certainly in my experience of companies like Shell, they've done a lot of good work around energy scenarios and forecasting of transitions. Josh, before I finish and close, a quick question was for you, that we are talking really about electricity and a big focus on electricity. It's only one part of the energy system. I guess from the European perspective, and if you could be short with your answer, would be great. There's a lot of investment happening in terms of heat and transport as well. Isn't it fair to say? It's not just electricity.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, transport is partly electrifying. So that is where the batteries and the electric vehicles come in. But just to pick on the last element that Thomas made as well, and you asked is about oil. Let's not forget about gas and major industrial users. And that is where carbon capture and storage / hydrogen comes in again. I think I would strongly underline that this has potentially an important contribution to deliver in the context of climate neutrality in Europe and across the globe. We agreed that in the Paris Agreement, after all. So I think that needs to be differentiated according to the use of the energy. Is it the main user? Is it an industrial user? Or is it a private user? And the trend to electrification is going to continue for sure. I think that is without doubt that it is going to be still the main industries, manufacturing industry, having a demand for decarbonized fossil fuels, in particular gas.
Okay, thank you very much, Josh. It's 3 minutes past the hour, so I've overrun. So my apologies. Firstly, I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation to moderate. I'd like to thank especially Josh and Thomas for their participation and their intellect and input, and also to thank everyone for attending the webinar series on evaluating the role of sustainable energy in economic recovery packages. Please note that we have our next webinar in this series scheduled for September. This is also supported by Al-Attiyah, the foundation, in partnership with Refinitiv, and we look forward to welcoming you to that seminar again. So for me, for now, I'd like to close, and I'd like to thank the support that has come from Al-Attiyah and in partnership with Refinitiv, and close the event for now. Thank you all for participating. Bye-bye.